Welcome back, Honors. All right, so killed it in class the other day. Very, very impressed. Loved how y'all were like asking awesome questions and stuff. Shout out to a couple of the kids that were asking some really great questions. Allie Tao, Ava Woodruff, right? Shayla, great job. Very, very impressed. And a lot of it was really, really centered around the stuff that we were talking about, right? And we started talking about the Minoans, okay? So big things to understand where we're going, why we're talking about this stuff. What the heck are we doing here in the first place? Because a lot of what you know about ancient Greece really only comes from one of those time periods that's listed on the board right now, right? Whenever you're talking about ancient Greece, 9 times out of 10, you're referencing things that happened only in the classical period, right? You're usually referring to, or possibly the archaic Dark Ages, right? But you're only really talking about one small subset of their people, right? The Minoans were the very first people to actually occupy the place that you know of as Greece, right? The Mycenaeans would then follow them, and then Athens and Sparta would rise to power, and like all these other things. But it is important to understand that Greece is a dense, very intense, very open, amazing, multifaceted ancient civilization, right? And we started talking about the one that, ironically enough, we don't know as much about as the rest of them, right? We started talking about the Minoans, right? And we started asking like, oh, what are some things that show a lot of intelligence about the Minoans? And we looked at the Phistos disc, right? And LaCour answered it perfectly when she was like, oh, that must be their writing, right? Well, yeah, it was their writing system. And what did we call it again? Good job, Avery. Linear A. Very, very nice. Very impressed. So, big thing, though, going forward also, we know that they were traders, right? We know that we're traders, not traitors, like you jerk, but traders, right? And so how did we know that they were traders? Good job, Tiana, right? Because of the ships that they built and ones that we have discovered, yeah? And then also we talked about, like, another big thing about them, their very first religious ceremony and or possible sporting event, right? And we looked at this right here, and it was known as bull leaping, right? Bull leaping is possibly a very important part of their culture. And it's obviously, too, very important to understand that it seems that the bull happens to be a very commonly recurring theme throughout the Minoan era and the Minoan culture, right? That we have found bull statues, we have found bull artifacts, we have found, there's a very famous story that has to do with a bull that we're going to talk about here in a sec, but bull leaping and bull symbolism is heavily used. And we discovered a lot of that symbolism in this place. The place that is the best artifact, the place that is the best evidence, the place that is the best everything when we're actually referring to the people known as the Minoans. So when we're talking about the Minoans, we're usually talking about any artifacts that we can find, right? Because we don't know a ton about them. And also a big hindrance is that we don't understand their writing system, right? Linear A looks like a bunch of gobbledygook. And we've only ever discovered one major piece of it, and it was that Phistos disc, right? And actually, speaking of the Phistos disc, because it was discovered in this area, right? A small city on the coast of Crete known as Phistos. But that city is not big nor nearly as important as the palace of not Gnosis, not Gnosis, Kenosis, right? So the palace of Kenosis is the best artifact that we have of the Minoan people, right? It apparently was their massive palace and city and apparent home of the possibly legendary King Minos, right? King Minos of myth, right? The King Minos of later era, okay? But we don't know if Minos himself was actually real or not. We're not super positive. We haven't found any artifacts of his death, nor explicit, we've never found any artifacts of his death, nor explicit research that shows us that he was real, but he's still a major figure in their entire, in their civilization. So it is apparently also the political center of the Minoan kingdom, and a big thing about it was apparently we refer to it as being built in the style of a labyrinth, right? Now, a lot of it has to do with, by the way, what labyrinth means is like a maze, all right? Built in like a maze-like style. Now, ironically enough, it's more than likely built as this labyrinth due to the fact that it had a lot of hallways, and the more walls you had, the larger a structure you could build, right? So it probably just seems like it was built in the style of a labyrinth. But we do oftentimes refer to it as the Labyrinth Palace of Kenosis, right? And a lot of that also refers back to the myth about these people that we'll talk about here in a second, right? Because it is super important to understand, how is it possible that I've never heard of the Minoans? I know who Athens is, I know who Sparta is, I've even heard of Thebes before, and Hercules, the movie, best Disney movie ever. The big thing about it, though, is the only reason we know anything about the Minoans at all has a lot to do with oral tradition and myth, okay? So just so you know, mythologically speaking, some of the myths about the Minoan people are going to pop up during these three eras, right? Long after the Minoans had already been gone, right? During the Dark Ages, Archaic, Classical period, you were going to see, okay, some myths pop up, usually oral traditions based on the Minoans, right? Because the myths were two facets. Myths were used for two different things. One, explaining scientific events that Greeks couldn't understand, like why the sun rises, why the sky does this, why do the flowers bloom in spring? Oh, it's because of Persephone, and she's coming back with Hades, and da-da-da-da-da, or she's coming back to see her mom. And so, like, all of these myths explain scientific things that the Greeks at the time couldn't understand, right? But they were also used to document history, right? Because during the Dark Ages, Archaic, Classical period, they started to create myths that directly reference the Minoan people. So we do know that the Greeks themselves, the later ones, the Athenians and the Spartans, had knowledge of the Minoan culture, but what we have proof positive in the modern era is the palace ruins themselves, right? So we as historians know that the Minoans existed for a fact, and a lot of it is due to the ruins that were left behind, right? And this right here happens to be the biggest and best set of ruins that we could have possibly found. The Phaistos Disk is important, but the Palace of Kenosis and its remains are still there on the island of Crete. It's hands down one of the 10 places I got to go before I die. I'm really, really excited. It might be in the next year or so hopefully. But the big part about it is Kenosis set a lot of tones for other major historical developments throughout the rest of Greek culture and Western civilization in total. Big thing to actually look at, let's just go ahead and jump forward, is architectural tones, right? Looking at this picture of the Palace of Kenosis, we can tell that there is an architectural design that actually references directly and harkens back to Greek architecture in total, right? And that has to do with the heavy use of these bad boys. Exactly right, Colleen. Good job, right? The use of columns, okay? Now, the Greeks were heavy users of columns, and we do know that their architectural styles have bled in to Western civilization. We still use columns today to represent buildings of law, buildings of art, buildings of equity, buildings of, even some of y'all's houses have Greek columns in them. Now, the Minoans were the first ones to use the column in the Western civilization sphere, particularly in Greece. Theirs are going to be a little bit different from the columns that we're going to talk about in about 2 seconds, right? So the Minoans created columns that look like this, right? So, and the Minoan columns are a little bit different because they're fat at the top and thin at the bottom. And the capitals, which is the top little part right here, happens to be very, very simple, double layered, and just smoothed edge, right? So that's a Minoan style column. But here's the kicker, right? During the Dark Ages, Archaic, Classical, and even later into the Roman periods, we're going to see the development of other styles of Greek columns, right? But it all started here. It all started in Kenosis, right? All started as the original kind of tone setter was in Kenosis. Now, big thing going forward, though, we have 3 types of columns that you do need to write down. Put this anywhere in your notes, somewhere off to the side. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be anywhere in particular. But it is important to understand that Kenosis and the Minoans started a trend that we still use now, right? And there are 3 types of prominent Greek columns, right? 3 types of columns. Now, I'm sure if any parents are watching this right now, they're like, oh, I know those. I learned about those in college, right? Or you might have learned about them in Fine Arts Survey with Doc, right? So, big things, though, we have 3 types of Greek columns. You have the simplest one first, which is just a curved top, right? Very, very simple. And then eventually they would progress forward throughout time. And you would end up with ones that look like this, right? So, and they would actually look like that. That is another type of column. All judged by their capitals, right? The capitals that actually top the columns themselves. And then the last one, they look like this. Looks kind of like a leaf or a palm tree growing out of a pot almost, and then bang, bang, right? So these are the 3 types of Greek columns. These are the worst drawings I've ever drawn in my life. Now, but going forward, just so you know what they are, these are Doric columns, right? And these are Ionic columns. And then these right here are Corinthian columns, which were actually developed and produced in the Roman Empire as well, right? So to understand why I'm getting at this, the important part is Kenosis serves as the first architectural evidence of the use of columns in architecture in the Western sphere, and their use of them carried through to the entire Greek civilization, and we would keep progressing these architectural things better, but again, they were first used in Greece, right? All the way up to this one, which is actually kind of like a neat story behind it. Apparently, an architect of either Roman or Greek descent apparently looked at the great grave site of a little girl that had a fern on top of it, and he decided to develop a column with a fern-like top after seeing that grave site, right? The Corinthian column. Now, getting after it, though, let's keep going. So looking at Kenosis, we know we see a lot of very important, very, very historic, very intense Western civilization kind of leftovers, right? Now, we also can see right here, we can see the labyrinth-style building of it as well. You can see all the walls and the narrow hallways and the stairs leading up to a second level. So we know it was a very large, multi-leveled structure. But you can see how narrow and maze-like some of these hallways were. Now, again, it was probably done this way just to hold up the weight of the roof, because the simple architects during the time of the Minoans would have thought the more walls we have, the less likely it is for the roof to cave, right? So, but here's the big stuff. Some of the rooms were kept completely intact, right? So, absolutely ridiculous that this building, this Palace of Kenosis, is almost devoid of a roof, but some of its art and rooms were completely preserved. These right here, this room in particular, is over 3,000 years old. 3,000 years old, and the art looks like it was painted 3 weeks ago, right? So this art form we will talk about here specifically in a moment, but I'm not going to get to it right now. But it's just impressive to see how many artifacts we have of the Minoans left over. Now, we believe that this is either a religious ceremony room, possibly also the king's throne room could have been that, because of we think it might have been for religious ceremony because of the offering plate. It could have possibly been for the king because of the throne-like seat right here that I think looks conspicuously like a toilet. But speaking of toilets, they even had what? Plumbing. The Minoans developed plumbing 3,000 years ago, and then it would plumbing would exist in the Western sphere all the way up until the ancient Romans, and then the Romans fell in 470. 100 years after Christ was born. Plumbing wouldn't exist in Europe again until the late 1800s, right? Royals, kings of countries were going to the bathroom in pots and pitching it out the window, while the Minoans, thousands of years ago, developed a method to actually go to the bathroom and have it go away, all right? It's a pretty impressive thing, and it's really important so you can just understand the intelligence that was the Minoans. Because what we're seeing right now is intelligence, art, plumbing, design, architecture, right? That was right there is what we believe Kenosis looked like at its height. Look at this glorious palace, right? A palace that apparently can hold over 1,000 people inside of it at any given time, was developed thousands of years ago on a small island of Crete off the coast of Greece, being our very first legit Westerners, right? Look at this thing. It was such a big deal that it inspired myth, right? Such a big deal that it inspired a crazy, intense myth about this particular figure, right? Another bull-like figure. So if any of y'all have ever actually heard of this particular myth before, we're talking about Theseus and the Minotaur, right? So big thing about it, though, is I'm not going to tell you the myth right now. We are going to talk about it in class tomorrow, all right? So we're going to kind of go over it, see what you remember, see what you know. But I'm not going to tell you because it would end up being a 6-minute long story, and I can tell you that in live in person, right? But I kind of brush up a little bit. My Latin scholars, see what you remember about Theseus and the Minotaur, right? But it's important to kind of understand that, again, Theseus and the Minotaur, though, is a very important myth to show you that the Athenians and the Spartans from the archaic period are actually going to be aware of who the Minoans are. So if I were to back up. So as we know, the Minoans existed all the way back here, right? Long before the Spartans or the Athenians ever actually existed, before they were even a thought in the grand scheme of Western civilizations. But for some reason, we got archaic Greeks that are actually, and Dark Ages Greeks from these two particular areas, talking about people from this long ago. So these myths, this myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, serves as a great example of how Greeks would use mythological oral tradition, telling these stories to one another, to even document historical concepts, to document civilizations and societies that existed hundreds of years before they ever actually knew who, before we even knew who they were, right? Because the Athenians and the Spartans were aware of the Minoans, right? But it's ironic that we walk around in the modern era, and most people don't know who the Minoans are at all. But thousands of years ago, people that couldn't even barely write knew who they were, right? So, but it is important to know, and we will talk about that myth a little bit more later. Also, very important thing to understand is just the difference in gender relations of the Minoan people as well. So just so you understand, the Minoans apparently, in so many of their artworks, we find images of female priests, which is unheard of in ancient societies. It is absolutely wildly unheard of to ever hear about a female priest being depicted in most polytheistic religious structure and also any Western civilization, especially the Greeks, right? Because they were actually very, very kind of disenfranchising to women, right? Athenian women weren't even allowed to leave their house without a man's permission, right? But in the Minoan culture, in Kenosis, we have depictions of female priests outside of religious ceremony. So there's a chance that Minoans might have also viewed women a little bit differently, maybe more as life-giving and something to look up to instead of actually necessarily being something to push down, right? Also, we even see in their religious structure, they had female goddesses before the other gods were even invented, okay? Just so you know, Zeus, Athena, Hera, Poseidon, all those guys were invented during this time period, the Greek Dark Ages, by a guy named Hesiod that we'll talk about later on. But, so that means that the Minoans must have had a different religious structure. They had different gods. They didn't actually believe in Zeus and all this other stuff. This was one of their chief gods, or goddesses, a snake goddess that we have found several statues of inside of Kenosis. I say we because I secretly wish I was there, but still. All right, so anyway, now, but the big thing going forward, though, is their views of women seem to be very different. Now, Minoans also successfully created one of the very first and most intense art forms that have ever been created in all of Western civilization in totality. And those happen to be frescoes, right? Frescoes are going to be a thing that even modern-day artists struggle to create, right? They have a very difficult time making them. Because the interesting part about creating a fresco is it's kind of like what I'm about to paint right here on my board. So I would be sitting here with a blank canvas, just a wall, actually. Frescoes are almost always put on walls or ceilings, the most famous of them being like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, and or his Last Judgment, which is also in the Sistine Chapel, and or the Last Supper, which is in Milan. I could keep going, but I'm not. All right, so, but the big thing is we would have like a blank wall, right? And the way it would work is apparently an artist would come up with a specific square in mind. And they would go like this. In Italian, we refer to this as the intonaco, which is like one section that we're going to be doing. And the artist would then come up and smear plaster all over this one section, right? And they would allow it to sit there for about 2 seconds so it could barely harden. And then they would come up with wet paint, and then they would, just draw or paint something on top of it, right? Smiley. All right, so, but the big thing about it is then this would dry, and what happens in a fresco is the plaster and the paint bond together, and then as it dries, the fresco becomes permanent, able to survive the rigors of time, right? This one right here, again, another version of a fresco, showing another link to the seafaring people that the Minoans were, of course, having dolphins and things like that depicted in it. Where's my other? Oh, there's my columns. Yeah. All right. So now showing dolphins and their depictions of actually being the Minoans being related to that kind of sea-like society. The great thing about these is they have lasted for thousands of years because of that bonding type. And like I said, modern-day artists struggle to make those, right? And this is another famous fresco that actually exists in Kenosis. This is of a woman harvesting saffron. Yet again, we have another depiction of a female figure, which is a very interesting thing, right? And this woman is harvesting saffron because according to some of our documentation from other civilizations is that apparently the Minoans used saffron flowers to make dye, right? To dye textile with that nobody else had access to, but they grew wild in Crete. So they would actually harvest these things and trade them to get things they needed, like agricultural goods, because the farmland was so terrible in Greece, right? So this, another very important concept coming up, is this thing right here, right? The Philo Cup. All right, now, really quickly, before we go any further, have you noticed any depictions of warriors? Any depictions of soldiers? Any depictions of, yar, stabby stab, any kind of that stuff? No! You don't find those things in Minoan culture. You see art, you see intelligence, you see craft work, you see architecture, you see these different things, right? Now, this is an example of that intense artwork. This, the Philo Cup, is actually one of the remaining metallurgically bronze cast, gold-plated cups that exist that we have period, right? Some of you are like, why is this cup so important? Get to the point, Mr. Terry. Well, check this out. I'm getting there, all right? We know it's a Minoan cup because of the imagery used on the outside. We see the bull right here. We see Minoan-style human figures that are developed often in their art, and we see a heavy amount of Minoan imagery, right? So we believe, we're like 90% confident that this cup was created by the Minoan people, right? Now, the interesting part, though, is where did they find it? They found this cup on mainland Greece. But wait a second. Back up, Terry. I hear you. Yes, you are 100% right, Riley. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Riley's like, wait a second. I thought you said that these people were from Crete. I did say these people were from Crete, right? So why the heck did this cup end up so far away? Some of you are probably theorizing, oh, maybe somebody picked it up and took it with them, right? Maybe somebody found it or whatever. But this was found in an architectural site. Not an architectural site. An archaeological site. Sorry about that. All right, so an archaeological site that was originally supposed to belong to a different group of people. So what does this tell us, right? This tells us that the Minoans must have traded with somebody on mainland Greece, right? That they must have interacted with another group of people that existed at about the same time that they did, right? So no one is certain why the Minoan civilization came to an end. We're not positive. We have a lot of theories, right? The two leading theories have to be, one has to do with a natural disaster because of a volcano known as Mount Thera. It erupted on an island right nearby Crete, and the ash and the destruction caused by that volcanic eruption might have actually destroyed some of the crops and sent possibly the Minoans into a famine. But another theory is that they might have been taken over by these guys, right? Where we found that cup in an area known as Mycenaea, right? Because in about 1400 BC, control of the sea and of Crete passed to a different group of people, the Mycenaeans. And if we look at our time periods, right? So now as the Minoans fall, the Mycenaeans are on the rise, right? So the Mycenaeans are going to be the ones that end up controlling Greece following the Minoan period, right? And the Mycenaeans could not be any more different than the Minoans. That's why they're so different, and they get their own time period, right? The Mycenaeans are a very different group of people. They're going to show up around 1600 BC, right? They're going to last till about 1100, so they're not a long-lived empire. But where did they come from is the better question. If we're talking about Greece right now, how did these people end up in Greece? Where did they come from? Was it Minoans that went off? No, we believe that the Mycenaeans came from the grasslands of southern Russia. So you understand really quickly, just to kind of wrap your noggin around it, you have to understand that people during these time periods, especially during the ancient era, were very migratory, right? We talked about the Hyksos that migrated into Egypt during their second intermediate period, right? We talked about how there's a chance that a group of the Hyksos broke off and became the Hebrews, right? People migrate a lot. And apparently, the Mycenaeans may have been a barbaric, quote-unquote, not trying to say that they didn't know anything, but according to the Minoans, they might have been considered barbaric. But they would have been a nomadic group of people that probably didn't have a written language and didn't have any type of farming techniques, would have migrated into southern Greece looking for somewhere to settle. They probably would have came into contact with the Minoans, and the Minoans would have shown them how to farm in these areas, how to survive, how to herd goat, how to do all these other things, right? Except they weren't located in Crete. The Minoans are from, or not the Minoans, the Mycenaeans are from this area of Greece, known as wait, where are we going? Where are we going? Nope, wait, stop it. They would have been from, there we go, this area of Greece, known as Peloponnese, all right? That is the southern chunk of Greece. This mainland area that is connected by this strait is called Peloponnese, all right? So Peloponnese is where they were located, while the Minoans were located right down here on Crete, okay? And we believe Mount Thera erupted like right around here. So the big thing about it also to understand is that the Mycenaeans, so they're a completely separate people from the Minoans, right? When we're looking at the Mycenaeans, a really fishy thing kind of happens, right? Not fishy as in like Minoan, like Frescos and Dolphins and stuff, but fishy as in odd, right? So when we look at the Mycenaean people, we can take their time period and we can break it down into two separate chunks, right? Oh, God, I know one of y'all is freaking out right now. I guarantee it's probably somebody like, I don't know. Probably like Bourgeois, right? Her and Brooke are probably simultaneously freaking out because you are twins and you share the same brain. So I know you're freaking out right now. You're telling me there's time periods within time periods? Yes, it's like Inception in a history class, right? Now, the big thing about it is the Minoans can be broken down into two basic chunks, right? These two phases of Minoan history. One being called the shaft grave era and the other one being called the coin or quine era. That word, write this down, quine in Greek means common, all right? That means that they started speaking a language that you would often call Greek. Now, in our class, though, I typically try to break it down doing an analysis of how they bury people, right? So we go from the shaft grave era, and then we talk about like how they adopted beehive burial techniques, right? So let's talk really, really quickly about how this progression seems really, really weird, right? How it seems very, very odd. Now, so originally, Mycenaeans, during their first era, dug these things, right? They were called shaft graves, right? So really fast, when we're looking at a shaft grave, I'm going to show you a cross-section of one really quick, just so you know exactly what I'm talking about. A shaft grave is a very, very simple tomb in and of you will, okay? So if we're looking at this simple kind of tomb, a shaft grave looks something like this, right? Looking over here, it is literally a small circle, right? And each grave would be marked with what you would call a stone slab or a headstone, right? And what you would see is a big, long hole that would be dug beneath that headstone, right? Some of you are like, well, this sounds kind of like how we bury people now. Yes, ironically enough, but it is still, in a sense, kind of primitive, right? So they would dig this really, really deep hole, right? And about 12 meters, sometimes as deep as 40 feet, sometimes only as deep as 10 feet, right? And they would create, at the bottom of this large shaft, a grave site, right? They would create like a coffin out of stone. They would place stone slabs on the bottom, they would put the body there, and they would put around the body precious items that existed for that person during their time. Treasures of this wealthy person or this leader, right? And then they would stack stones up on the side, and then they would cap it off with a stone slab. And then they would bury that tomb, and they would go all the way to the top, mark it with a headstone, bang, that's where what's-his-face is buried, right? So, big thing about it, though, is with the shaft grave era, even though it seems simple, even though it seems rudimentary, even though it seems very ancient and not that smart, the great thing about it for historians is that we have found a lot of artifacts of theirs, right? So because it was buried so deep, a lot of things were actually held onto. This right here being the most famous artifact from the shaft grave era of Mycenaea, that is the death mask of Agamemnon, right? The death mask of Agamemnon. Now, some of your parents, if they're listening to this right now, are probably like, Agamemnon, I know that guy. He's the dude that apparently hired Achilles, right? And they chased after Helen of Troy or way over to Troy to get her back from Paris, right? Well, Agamemnon is a figure of myth, and we're not positive if he was real, but the German archaeologists that found this thing in the late 1800s were like, this has got to be Agamemnon. This is the nicest Mycenaean artifact I've ever found. We don't know for that for sure, but it still serves as a very good key piece of artifact evidence of the Mycenaean people, right? Even though it might not be Agamemnon's, it serves as a very good piece of evidence for us, showing that maybe artistically and metallurgically they were not as sophisticated as the Minoans at first, because we don't see realistic perspective on this, right? We know for a fact no one's ears are this far apart. We know for a fact that no one's face looks quite like this, right? But it does show Mycenaean art, quote unquote, at its earliest. Now, some of the better things we've found in shaft graves are things like these, right? Which are depicted heavily around Mycenaea. That right there is a boar tusk helmet, right? Made out of simple bronze, so it shows us that the Mycenaeans learned how to wield bronze or smelt bronze, right? And apparently, whenever they would hunt boar, wild boar that does exist in northern Greece, they would actually take the boar tusks and slice them down and line their helmets with it to show their kill and also show how strong of a warrior they were. Now, really quickly though, what are we saying right now? Warrior. Ooh, that means to us that the Mycenaeans were probably very militaristic, right? That is the key difference between them and the Minoans, right? The Minoans were artistic and very, very intense and made phenomenal architecture and used their intelligence. The Mycenaeans seem like they might have been a little bit more about war, right? So that's important to remember. It's very, very important to remember because the Mycenaeans would actually take over the entire Aegean Sea at one point. We'll talk about that here in a second, okay? No, actually, we're going to talk about that in class because it's the last thing we got to talk about. But then eventually we saw the fall of the Minoans and then the birth of what is known as the coin era in Greece, or the quine era in Greece, right? Not quinine, that's a medicine. But the beehive burial period, right? So we saw the Mycenaeans start out as kind of unsophisticated, simple shaft grave, and then they leapt forward in intelligence, and they started developing things like these when they would bury people. And these are called beehive burial chambers, right? Because it actually looks like a beehive, except it's underground, right? So the Mycenaeans, sorry, I'm going to do that a lot. The Mycenaeans began to develop grave sites that are far and away more architecturally complex, more architecturally intense, and more showing of a growth in their intelligence when they started building things like this. When their rulers now would die, they would not just shaft grave them, they would instead Feed them a beehive burial chamber. Build them a beehive burial chamber. Build them a beehive burial chamber. Say that 5 times fast. Now, they would literally cut into a hillside and dig out under the hill itself and create a beehive chamber lined with stones, right? So that way one could walk in and see the body of one of their former rulers or kings at any moment. He would have all of his treasures and artifacts around his body, and the body would be kept preserved there, right? So this beehive burial chamber is really important. They would also have sacrificial ceremonies of sheep out front, and the inside would be covered with gold rosettes and decorations, right? So we just saw you go from dig hole deep, put body down there, to building these. So that shows us that the Mycenaeans had a huge leap forward, right? This may play into the theory that the Mycenaeans took over the Minoans and then adopted or culturally diffused their ideas and intelligence into their society, because they didn't just start making things like beehive burials, they also started making complex pots and artwork, right? They started creating their own versions of frescoes that the Minoans had created long before they did. But here's the other scary part. What happens when a militaristic society becomes very intelligent? They start wanting to take stuff over. And that right there is a full bronze set of armor that a Mycenaean warrior may actually wear. So we're going to stop right there, and that is going to be like what we're getting to right now. And we'll talk about the Mycenaeans trying to take over everybody, and they had a very famous war with a nearby Turkish city-state. We'll talk about that later on. Y'all have a good one.